This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 167.
But I found a way to curate primary and secondary source materials and to put them in front of students. And instead of being, that sage on the stage, instead of it being my opinion of what we're reading, why we're reading it, and what that author is trying to say, I facilitate the students driving that discussion on their own.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Ken Ehrman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I'm here with my co-host, Raymond, the Dr. Benavides. Raymond,
Thank you so much.
Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast, officially as a guest co-host. You've been a guest many times. I'm very blessed and fortunate and thankful to have you here as a co-host. So how was your first conversation?
I really enjoyed it. There's so many amazing teachers out there. I wish I could speak to every single one of them, but this is a perfect way to do so. And especially not only that is sharing their voice and allowing them to have a voice with this platform and for others to learn. And I've been following the podcast for several years now, and I've listened to many of the episodes, and every single episode is different, but every single episode brings its own unique learning lesson and within it. And the way you all have it set up and the way you keep it real, allows us, the listener, to to understand what's going on in the world of teaching. And with that, and now turning the roles around and being a co-host, I'm really excited, and I know I'm going to be enjoying it, and I enjoyed this conversation as well.
Yeah, we had Tara Cocanower, who is the 2023 Indiana Teacher of the Year, and she really brought it. It was a great conversation. She's very, very passionate about civics and very, very passionate about history. But the conversation, like so many of ours, you could be a music teacher, you could be a science teacher, you could be an elementary teacher, and the instructional approaches that she takes, the ways that she connects with students, the way she establishes relationships, the way she facilitates learning is something that I think can be applied to any classroom and any teacher out there. Was there one big takeaway that you had from the conversation?
Completely agree. You just mentioned the relationships she creates. And I'm a firm believer in that, is that with our academic and lived experiences that we bring to the classroom, that allows us to create those relationships with our students. And once you create that relationship with your students, but a genuine relationship, where it's authentic and where the students feel safe in your classroom, like she said, they'll break down walls, move mountains for you. And that was one thing that I know that she brings, and she puts her wholehearted effort in creating those relationships. And it was amazing for us to hear that.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. So let's jump right into that conversation with Tara. We'll hear from Teach Better, and then we will jump into that conversation with her. Thank you.
All right.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcast. Now let's get back to the episode.
Hi, Tara. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How you doing tonight?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to jump into this conversation. So please kick things off for us nice and simple. Please officially introduce yourself. Let us know where you are coming from and give us a snapshot of your career in education.
Okay, my name is Tara Cocanower, and I am the 2023 Indiana Teacher of the Year. More so, I am a very, very proud Hoosier, representing my students and the teachers of the state of Indiana. But my path in education really started wanting to be Indiana Jones. I am a history teacher, so that kind of parallels with one another. But as a kid, I wanted to be Indiana Jones. I wanted to be an archaeologist. And just going forward, I never lost that passion for learning about the past and learning about how to put ideas together. But teaching to me was never prestigious enough, and it was never lucrative enough. So when people told me, like, I just see that spark in you, I see that you're a teacher, I kind of blew them off. I just disregarded their advice, and I kept moving forward, and I wanted to be a foreign service officer. When I graduated college, I was terrified. I got education as a backup, which I hate. I hate to use that term. It is not a backup. It's my passion now. But I got it, and I still was fighting the calling to be an educator. So I joined the Peace Corps because I wanted to go experience a little bit of the world, and I wanted to serve others. And it was during the Peace Corps when I really started to dig in and like, what am I going to do after this? Am I going to stay abroad? All I kept coming back to was, I don't know what I have to do. I just have to teach. So maybe it's teaching somewhere in the world. Maybe it's going back home. But I knew I wanted to be in a classroom. And I learned that those four walls, they aren't as much of a hindrance to experiencing the world and having adventures as I once thought they were. So that's kind of where I started. I went to school at the University of Southern Indiana, where I had a professor that just saw something in me and pushed me. I played golf in college, and now I am a teacher. I am a coach. I love to teach both inside and outside of the classroom, on the golf course, around the track, just on the basketball court, everywhere I can find myself with a kid, because youth are so important, and that's what I've decided to dedicate my life to. Yeah,
that's amazing. What would you say? So we've had the opportunity to talk to different educators that went into different careers before education.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I didn't do that. And I'm not saying that it's a necessity, but I think that teachers that experience different careers, or in your case, the Peace Corps, before going into education, just have a little bit of a broader perspective in what is important, what skills we need to develop in our students. So what would you say are one or two values or lessons you learned from your time in the Peace Corps that has stayed with you throughout your career in education that you feel is directly impacted by that time prior to entering education?
Oh, I love that question. The value that I always begin every single lesson that I plan, every single hook that I'll use at the beginning of the day, when I think about what's going to bring me joy in the classroom, I always start with empathy. What's going to drive us to connect in some way with what we're doing? And I'm blessed to teach world history. So I get to connect kids with some of the good, the bad, and the ugly of what happens in our world. And I get to see their hearts break. And then I get to be trusted for a moment with rebuilding, their hope and their joy in the world. And it's just incredible to see them start to care about something in the world that they didn't know anything about until we started a lesson or till we had an activity in class. So for me, that value of empathy, I really learned. I mean, obviously, did I learn it from my parents? Yes, my parents are incredible people that serve. They're lifelong 4-Hers who serve the youth in our community. But I learned it from my grandparents. My grandpa was the potentate of the Mizpah Empire, of the Mizpah Temple. He was a Shriner growing up, and my grandma worked in the hospital. I learned things from my family. But then when I got to Romania, my bubble was burst, right? I didn't have the comfort of my family and my friends. I had to learn a new language. I was living in the middle of Transylvania in Romania, getting doors slammed in my face. Because even as a historian, I didn't understand that under the Ceausescu regime during communism, volunteering was obligatory. It was mandatory. I didn't understand those things. I hadn't dug deep enough to know my history like I should have. And so getting those doors slammed in my face, it taught me just a little piece of empathy for, what this word means something different to them. I need to present the ideas. I just need to ask for help. When I was vulnerable and I was going up humbly, with humility and asking them for help, they would do anything for me. Incredibly hospitable people. So it was really just sitting with them, creating space for them, and holding their stories in my heart that I carry with me all the time in my classroom. It's what makes me a storyteller. I love to share those things in my classroom, and the kids just like anytime I can get them, and I know they're just hanging on till the next part of the story I'm going to tell. It means I have a huge responsibility to make sure I'm speaking both honestly and I'm representing the people I'm speaking about well. So I have to know my stuff, and I have to lead with empathy, because that's what I want my students walking out of my classroom with. Beyond that, just values wise in my classroom, I want my students obviously to have a respect for history, right? There's that cliche, like those who don't know history are
Mhm.
doomed to repeat it. I like much better those who don't know history are like a tree that doesn't know they're a part of the forest, right? They don't know that they're a part of something so much bigger than themselves. And our kids need a sense of belonging. Like they need to feel that felt safety, that they're not alone in their classroom, they're not alone in our community, they're not alone in the world. And so that it sounds all like sunshine and rainbows and hugs, and but that's really why I do what I do, and it's why I teach what I teach. So all of my world history lessons from when I taught 7th grade to now when I teach seniors in AP World History, sophomores, juniors, and seniors in AP World, I still lead with empathy and human rights kind of ideas in the classroom. So yeah, and I picked that up from Romania. I mean, they taught me a lot. I was humbled, and so it allows me to have a little more power when I speak to students. They respect me a little bit more for it. Does that answer the
And going
question?
back to, I love it. I'm a firm believer that every educator is molded by their lived and academic experiences. And
Absolutely.
we bring that to the classroom unknowingly, but subconsciously we're there. And it's part of who we are and what we bring and the stories that we share.
Yep.
So with that being said, you were talking about empathy. Now coming along and where we're at right now, how do you get your students to be empathetic of whatever everything else that's going around them? How does that empathy play into the lessons that not just under Romania, but even the current situations that are going on right now, and the things that come in and out of right where it's history, the making every day we're making history. So how is it
Yes.
that you're able to put your spin on what empathy is and what it means for us to move forward as a society in the lessons that you deliver?
And
I
I was just going to jump in real quick. I'm sorry if you said this in your introduction, Tara, but can you remind me, at least if you said it, what grade levels do you teach?
Mhm. So right now I teach 9 through 12. I
Mhm.
teach world history, I teach AP world history, and I teach a principles of teaching course, which is like a grow your own teachers
Okay.
graduation pathway that we have in the state of
Okay.
Indiana.
All right. Sorry. Go ahead. Jump on
You're good.
Raymond's question.
All right. So yeah, and it cut out just a little bit there, but I think I know what you're going with. And I always like it tenses me up a little bit. And I think about that idea. I know what I teach can be difficult to hear sometimes. And I just got done this evening giving a speech to student teachers who are about to enter the profession. And as a social studies teacher, I've had those times where I have to teach controversial things. I have to teach my standards, and those standards can be hard to hear. Those standards can hurt your heart. They can be hard to talk about. They can be politically difficult at the time. And I want to make sure I'm not putting my spin on it. I want to make sure I'm helping students develop their own worldview. So for me, that's always been, I never had textbooks in the classroom. I taught in an inner
Mhm.
city charter school for a while. Obviously, teaching in Romania, I had to carry my own firewood to my classroom at times. So I didn't have many resources, but I found a way to curate primary and secondary source materials and to put them in front of students. And instead of being, that sage on the stage, instead of it being my opinion of what we're reading, why we're reading it, and what that author is trying to say, I facilitate the students driving that discussion on their own. So that's one of the ways where I like to say I protect myself a little bit from getting into the power struggles with people, or the arguments that come with politically motivated lessons,
Mhm.
or the critiques against teachers trying to, that word, indoctrinate students, right? No,
Right.
we're giving
Mhm.
students the opportunity to develop their own worldview. and I'm going to talk about the hard things because I want my students to leave my classroom and know that they are somehow prepared for what they're going to experience in the world. That empathy that we spoke about earlier, but more so the perspective. I mean, I live in a small rural town in Northeast Indiana. And we have families who have opened up their homes for Ukrainian refugees. I live near one of the largest populations of Burmese refugees outside of Myanmar. And I want my students to know that they don't have to go across an ocean to experience the world. The world is where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have to learn about these things. But if I'm just giving them information, then they're not experiencing those things, right? They're not making those connections to be able to drive their own actions in the future. So that, I hope that answers your question. It's a difficult thing because, I mean, we live in a highly charged society right now. We are more divided than ever. But the one thing that we agree on, over 90% of parents, and Indiana just had its inaugural Civics Summit, and where we all partnered together to talk about this. But over 90% of parents agree that civics education is important for their child to have.
Mm-hmm.
And civics is not just knowing the 3 branches of government. Civics is knowing how to be a citizen of your country, of your community, but also the world. And that's what I want world history to be about. Yeah.
So having your students dive into primary resources, I think, is such a powerful experience for them to be able to compare and contrast to what they're seeing in secondary resources, and also just develop their ability to read what was documented at the time, the perspectives of those individuals, and how it can influence their decisions and reflect on the decisions we're making ourselves in current times that someone's going to analyze in 200 years. Mm-hmm. And also in a time where students probably are receiving all of their information from social media headlines,
right.
social media clickbait. They're not actually, I mean, adults are probably doing the same thing, more than
right.
ever. Okay. So just with what students are, the way that information is disseminated nowadays. So do you have activities or things you're doing with your students where they are looking at even fully written articles with what we would consider to be reputable news organizations, and the lack of information that they actually have in the article, or how they're starting with something that's very clickbaity, and then maybe 2/3 of the way down the article, that's when they present the other side that has more information that would actually make the article almost moot or just not worthy?
So, like, how do I vet those resources?
And how do you do anything with the students to have them vet those current
absolutely.
resources?
So I think that's the part of civics that's digital citizenship, right? My grandparents actually brought this up with me a while back and said that part of the reason our society is so divided is because we don't get our information from the same sources anymore, right? Not everybody in town is reading the newspaper anymore, and we're talking about the same articles. So we don't have a shared commonality of where that information is coming from. So for me, 10 years ago, I got to attend the Teaching for Primary Sources Institute at the Library of Congress. And at the Library of Congress, they kind of walked us through a lot of the training on, number one, the Library of Congress is the largest library in the world. So the things that are there and the lesson plans that have been created and the teachers that have vetted them through the Teaching with Primary Sources, the Institute, and they have like their own teacher social media platform, the TPS platform. There are sources there. Like, I don't have to curate them by myself anymore. I don't have to have Google folder upon Google folder for every unit that I teach. Now there are primary source sets. Last year, my teacher of the year cohort, we got to work with the Smithsonian, and they're creating things and artifacts to try to vet and curate those things for us. But for me, when it comes to more political things or current events, modern current events that are happening, I never want students to just, hey, willy-nilly go out and Google things all the time. But there will be times where I'll send them out to Google something, we'll bring our sources back, and then we use that corroboration tool to make those connections. How do these things agree? How do they disagree? We use it used to be called the Stanford History Education Group, but now it's called the Digital Inquiry Group, DIG. And they have lessons from US history, world history that are created to build that skill. But it's do you create those opportunities? Do you partner with parents so they understand where you're coming from to put students in the position to do that? So yeah, for me, it's just about getting out there a little bit myself and being brave enough to dig into things that I don't necessarily know about and let students drive the discussion, but to be aware of where they're going and like understanding you have to know who the author is. You have to know what biases are, and if there's some kind of agenda coming with the topic, because they're in English classes and they're learning how to write persuasive pieces, but they're not really digging into understanding that they are clickbait. And I have a challenge with my students that they can try to rickroll me throughout the year, and they try to connect things to the email. And I'm like, guys, do you not know if you post a YouTube video to email, it pops up at the bottom? Like, I know you're trying to rickroll me. So you have to be much more. You need to be more creative in order to rickroll me. And I know now that I say that, my students are gonna take this to a whole different level if they hear me say that. But yeah,
So
it's one of those things where we can either shy away from it or we can dig in. And I think that students, they deserve for us to be able to take some, hey, we're going to dig into this, but I want you to know in no way is this me, like my opinion has no place here, really. What we're digging into here is what the world is saying. And I think I use Wikipedia for that. Wikipedia is a great experience. I used to trick kids and put false information in there just to see if they're tricked. But now kids are starting to get wise.
Right. You mentioned going back to comparing the primary secondary resources about presenting it, opening it up to them, and facilitating an environment where they're exploring that. So I'd love for you to dig into that a little bit more from an instructional side. So not thinking necessarily focused on civics, but thinking about for teachers that just want to allow their students to explore content, facilitate a discussion, draw conclusions. What are some instructional strategies that you utilize to facilitate a learning environment where students are motivated, they're on task, and they're able to overcome challenges and work in a more independent environment like that?
Okay. One of the things that I've realized recently is that students can't really dig in and they can't really analyze those texts without the background knowledge, right? We're learning that where social studies was pulled from so many elementary schools because we just don't have time. Oh, we're throwing some things into the reading aspect, but reading comprehension is not going to happen without context. And that comes largely from social studies and science. So when we look at that within the classroom, right now I'm using things like AI instructionally to create choose your own adventure scenarios where I put my objectives, I put the framework of what I want to happen for students, and they get to experience. So right now we're in the middle of World War I, and they're going over the causes of World War I. So then I can introduce to them pieces of information and German perspectives, British perspectives, historical narratives that they can then drive. Wait, this doesn't match up with what the AI was saying. Is AI wrong? Because where's that getting its information from? Or is this document, is that bias? Is that what I'm seeing? So I'm using AI to introduce those things. Socratic seminars, obviously, where I drive inquiry and base that off of our primary and secondary source alignments. And I model like crazy. And I would say I've really dug into that in the last 5 years. I used to just tell my students, hey, I want you to go through this document. Then we're going to have some questions and we'll talk about sourcing. And I threw them into the deep end when they weren't ready. So now, before we ever get to that Socratic seminar, they've done the AI, choose your own adventure, maybe I always do pre-tests and post-tests. I like to use Google Forms, but I like to use Gimkit and quizzes. I'm trying to give them at least an awareness of people, places, vocabulary terms. And so then when I model the document, I use my iPad. I like technology in the classroom, but you could just as easily do it with pencil and paper. And I'll walk around the room and we'll talk about, wait, what is this saying here? And we might never get through the whole entire document, depending upon the participation that class is going through at the time. But my favorite thing about that is not every document is text driven. I have some like high special needs kids in my class right now who aren't diploma track, but they're in my history class because they love history and they're capable of doing things and experiencing what we're doing in the classroom in the Gen Ed World History room. So sometimes my documents are the Waldseemüller map of 1507. And every single kid, no matter of what challenges they struggle with, no matter if they have, what lexile they read at, every single kid can take a look at the Waldseemüller map and they can say, this is what I see. This is what I'm observing. And then as a class, we can help each other to reflect and ask questions about it. So I think in digging into text, you can't just throw text in there all the time. That's not all of the comprehension strategies we're working on. I need kids to know how to read a graph. I need kids to see maps. And I need them to be confident enough that their voice is worth something in the classroom. So that is kind of just within pedagogically, that's what I push kids to before I ever get them to, hey, we're going to go do this current event and we're going to analyze these two different perspectives against each other. Before we get to the German and the British perspectives of World War I, we've gone through the Waldseemüller map of 1507 on the second day of class. We've taken a look at a giant world map that I created in the middle of my classroom, and we use string to claim some of the land that happened with the Berlin Conference of 1884 or the Scramble for Africa, right? Like I feel things have to be tangible in some way too. I can't just throw kids into reading all the time or they'll mutiny against me. So I try to combine it with, and maybe that's the middle school teacher in me. I taught middle school for 8 years. And I think I came to the high school. And when I started teaching high school, I felt like rigor. I've got to push these kids, but no, they have to experience. The Indiana Historical Museum in Indianapolis says we do history. And that's what I like to say in my classroom too. We don't just learn history, we do history. So I have to give them the opportunities to do it. And it doesn't have to be analyzing text all the time. It sometimes can be a tea party that turns into a Socratic seminar. And why are they drinking tea? Oh, well, I'm going to tell them about the modern period and how tea represents, the opium wars between Britain and China. I trick them a little bit into things that they're going to be invested in because there's something tangible that they can root themselves in. I like it's constructivism, right? That's the idea of pedagogy. Of blending all these ideas together in order to help them comprehend.
What you've experienced over, how long have you been teaching?
16 years.
Okay.
Counting Romania.
Okay. So thinking about the trajectory of your career and how students have changed, how culture has changed, how the perception of civics and history has changed, what are one or two things that have stayed at your core in the essentials of establishing a positive learning culture and a positive classroom environment for your students to thrive in that have remained and you believe will continue to remain regardless of how society and how students change?
Okay. I mean, I think kids are kids are kids. People ask me that all the time about like, what was it like teaching in Romania? And I'm like, Romanian kids are just like American kids. They might have some different, they speak a different language and their home styles are different. Yes, they have differences, but as human beings, we have way more in common than we have different. So those shared experiences, those commonalities, kids are kids are kids. And I teach classical history. So we could go all the way back to Greece and Rome. We could talk about early civilizations. And we know that kids have always been a little bit on the edge of pushing the rules, right? Testing their limits. And that's happened since the beginning of civilization. So I have to like just psychologically understand, and I don't think this will ever change, that as teachers, we have to separate the behavior from the child. And I can go after that behavior, and I could put accommodations in place, and I can do everything in my power. I can have parent meetings, and I can set up different places to sit in the classroom, and I can accommodate tests, and I can get aides in to help me. I can do any number of things for that behavior. I got to love the kid. I have to. And I like that's never ever going to change for me. I don't care what that kid does. When I was in Romania, like I think I read my history books, but I can't explain what segregation looks like until I experience it. I remember going to the Roma school in my community and going back to the school where I taught, and and several people asking me, "Well, you're not going to go back, are you?" And I said, "Of course I am. Of course I'm going to go back. Those kids deserve an education just like everybody else. It doesn't matter what ethnicity they belong to." And so it's just like we talk about equity a lot, right? I didn't call, like, yes, it was equity. I didn't call that equity back then, and fighting to make sure every kid was seen regardless of their background. But that, like, it took me months to be allowed into that part of town. And I thought Peace Corps was going to be like that every day. Kind of think how I think teaching is going to be, changing the world and changing kids' lives every day. It doesn't feel that way. But yeah, kids are kids are kids. And I have to be able to meet a kid where they are, and just let go of the things that maybe I'm struggling with to do that. And the best educators I know are masters at that. And then beyond that, for who we are, I think we need to continue to be we need to start even being more flexible. Education is changing, like, quickly. There are changes coming that I think need to be seen, but change is hard. And not all change is worthwhile, right? We don't want just progress for the sake of progress. We want progress for the good of all the people that are being served. So I want to see people being adaptable and being flexible enough to make changes, because our kids deserve it.
Yeah.
And those changes don't have to be like, I love technology and I'm an early adopter, but we don't all have to be doing the same thing all the time, right? I don't want every teacher in the world to be jumping into AI right now. I want people to know that change happens incrementally. And when big changes start to happen, we need to get involved. We need to communicate with one another and not bury our heads in the sand. So for me, when all that change is coming in high school, I teach high school. So high school is changing. Everybody's talking about the Carnegie Unit. They're talking about how the Carnegie Unit was created in 1906. And why are we still basing our credit system in high school and college based on the Carnegie Unit? I want people to just be open to having conversations about things. That is hard to say, and people are going to struggle with it. I'm going to struggle with it, but we've got to do this together for the sake of kids. And it can't be bad moments in history that force change. Why can't we drive change from a place where we feel solid? And we talked about that during COVID, and everybody said, okay, this is the time to put changes in. But no, it was the time to care for each other and get our feet underneath us. And now change is starting to come. So those are kind of the two things. I know that was a roundabout way of saying that. But yeah, I want equity. I want kids to be seen and loved. I want change to be okay and not just a scary word. Yeah, I that's kind of what I see going forward. Everything else is, for me, like, have the individual freedom to do things. Like, teacher autonomy and teacher voice are always going to be at the root of what I want to see drive change and what I want to see drive equity discussions.
You had mentioned earlier about science and history kind of going along with each other. I was a science teacher for 13 years and just
Awesome.
left the classroom. But one of the key things that I would love to do in the classroom is having my kids form their own identity as being scientists.
Mhm.
So how do you ensure that all kids, because you say you work with a special group of students as well, what do you do? What strategies do you have in order for, I know you kind of touched on it a little bit, in order for your students to feel that they are historians in the making, or they are historians because somehow along the way they've kept history going within themselves, but they just don't know it yet. What kind of strategies do you allow them to embrace that identity in your classroom?
Well, and part of that for me is just how do I treat them, right? You tell your students that they're scientists. I tell my kids they're world changers,
Mm-hmm.
right? And world changers, I use that term specifically. It can be very cliche and all like silly, but I use that term specifically because a world changer doesn't just mean you're a historian, right? Because in the world history
Love it.
classroom,
Mm-hmm.
science and social studies and math and English language arts and welding and culinary, all of those things are relevant in my classroom. So for me, I have to put them in positions to actually be world changers if I'm going to call them that. So I have to make connections in my classroom. And for me, that's where like the idea of civics deserts comes in. So I live in a small town of about 10,000 people. Okay. I live in rural Indiana. I grew up on a pig farm and like I'm born and bred here. I'm from Bluffton, Indiana. And recently, um, I would forget who did this. There was a survey that came out and it talked about civics deserts and how if you live in a city, a mid-sized to large urban city, 30% of students don't know how to make connections to people to be an involved, engaged civic person, to be a citizen. 30% of people don't have connections to make that happen, to volunteer, to get involved. When you move to the rural areas of America, that number doubles.
Wow.
And it becomes 60%. So my responsibility as a Peace Corps volunteer, as a person who loves civics and loves to be involved in things, as a 10-year 4-H'er, as a person whose dad was the president of the 4-H, whose grandfather was a Shriner, right? As a person with connections, it is my job to connect my curriculum to who uses with the lessons that we're learning to change the world.
Mm-hmm.
So those connections, we have an incredible organization in our community called Forgotten Children Worldwide. And it was started by my friend Matt. And last year, Matt, so they fund transition homes and schools to combat human trafficking in Nepal, in India, in Malawi, Zimbabwe, so all over the world, in Uganda. So my friend Matt wanted to create a connection to education just so that he can use the things that he's learning about the world and the kids that he's serving worldwide, he could connect them to any school in America or the world. So he and I talked to each other and we partnered a little bit. He was traveling around northern India in a tuk-tuk and I created a game board where kids could access this game board through the Indiana Learning Lab all over the state.
Mm-hmm.
And they could click on the little videos and Matt pops up and explains the 7th grade social studies standards from in person in India, right? We have in Fort Wayne there, we have like everywhere has coffee roasters, right? You have your local coffee house, the delicious coffee you love. We have a place in Fort Wayne called Utopian Coffee that 19 years ago started by going to Colombia and partnering with men who had taken over farms that were used for coca plants. So they were creating cocaine and they were taking those plants out and replacing them with coffee plants and doing a person-to-person exchange and using that money to fund people in Colombia. So 2 weeks ago, every year, but 2 weeks ago, I just did this with my students and I had one of the guys from Utopian Coffee speak to my class. It doesn't always have to be bringing people in. Our welding teacher brings somebody in every Friday from the community to show this is what I do in my job. And here's what I learned in high school that applies to what I do now. Those kind of things are so important. And we have Zoom, we have Google Meet. We can make connections in ways that we could never make before. As a former Peace Corps volunteer, I am active with Worldwise Schools, which allows you to do a pen pal program with a Peace Corps volunteer, somebody around the world, and connect classrooms. There are a million different ways to do those things, but it's your rock star teachers that are making those connections. It's those teachers who are pushing the envelope a little bit. How do we help our first and second year teachers? How do we help them make the connections? Are we really mentoring them and getting those things done? And I'm just as guilty of this. There are times where I get lazy and I'm not connecting my kids to the world in the way that I should be. There are people in my community that deserve their voice to be heard, and my students need to hear from them. They don't just need to hear my voice. I'm not the keeper of all the knowledge. There are people in my community my students need to hear from, and sometimes I'm the barrier because I'm overwhelmed, or I'm not organized enough, or I just don't think far enough ahead, and I let all the stress and the strain and all the different hats that I wear get the best of me sometimes. But students deserve to not live in civics deserts. And if we really want our students to be voters, if we want our students to be productive citizens of our communities, and we want them to be good neighbors, we have to get them involved in these things so that they know where they can give their time. And the most important thing is my passion project does not have to be theirs.
Yep.
Right? Like, they need to know that. Like, I'm passionate about fighting against genocide, and I'm passionate about fighting against human trafficking. I'm passionate about civics. Some of my students want to go into the health field, and they need to be partnered with our local crisis pregnancy center.
Yes.
So that they can volunteer once a week after school and sit with little kids to support young mothers. So we owe it to our kids to connect what we call the real world, right? To connect, even though our students are living in their own real world, which is very real. But we need to connect those things for our students to be able to really be those foundational, fundamental elements of our democracy. Or we're not doing them any favors, and we're not going to love the world we live in when I'm 70, because those kids missed opportunities.
And next question is, because I know you mentioned about the principles of teaching, so about grow your own.
Yeah.
So how is that gone? How long have you done it for? And also, how is it that now you're able to put your advocacy hat on, where you always have your teacher advocacy hat on, but how is it now that you're bringing these young, hopefully future teachers, and talk about the real world of teaching and what the teaching life is all about?
I don't lie to them. So I've only taught it for 1
really
year.
Entails. How have you done that?
With all my speeches and travel that I've been doing over the last year, I took a step back this year from it, but I'm picking it back up next year and teaching it again. But for me, it's about honesty and vulnerability. Last year, when I was teaching the principles of teaching class, the most important thing I did was be honest about the things I was struggling with, the failures that I had. They watched me have nearly a panic attack in class and talked me through it. When I was getting ready to give speeches, so in Indiana, when the Teacher of the Year process is happening, they narrow it down to top 10 and then top 3. When you get to the top 10, you go to Indianapolis and you have to give a 2 to 3 minute speech. I'm not the most concise speaker. So I'm a storyteller. So 2 to 3 minutes was very nerve-wracking for me. And so I practiced my speech in front of my students, and they got to critique me, and they were my timers. They gave me good feedback. And that ownership that it created in them, from the top 10, they asked me. I was standing in the hallway, and they would constantly ask me, when do we know about top 3? When are we going to know? We, right? It's not about me at all. It's we. And that, to me, is that citizenship piece. When we got to the top 3, they were like, when are we going to know if we won or not? And I will never forget that. Like, I will carry that in my heart as long as I live, because those kids are a part of that journey with me, and vice versa. I am with them. And that's why we do what we do, right?
I can relate to that.
Mhm.
How
I can
so?
relate to that in a similar capacity. I was a finalist for Teacher of the Year in Pennsylvania in 2019, and I received my nomination on the last day of school. It was the nomination form signed by every parent of my homeroom.
Oh,
So
wow.
every parent signed it and submitted it to start that process for me, and that still remains like
So cool.
the best part for me, and those connections that we make with teachers or I'm sorry, with students is so important, and involving them in so many different capacities, I think is really important. So I'm currently serving as an interim elementary principal, and I was facilitating a peer coaching conversation with two first grade teachers this past week. And the one went to observe her colleague to just look at different strategies she used for a math workshop. And there were three different instructional takeaways that she had from observing her colleague.
Mhm.
And she was talking about her attempt to implement it, why she noticed it, what she liked about it. And she said all three times, I tried it with my students, and then I explained to them what the new strategy was, and we voted on it as a class, whether they liked it
Oh,
or not.
nice.
And they liked, this is first grade. They liked two of them. They didn't like the one. And she told them before this whole experience that she was going to go observe the other teacher, why she was observing them, what her goals were. Involving students in those conversations is so important. And it was one of my best strategies for accomplishing my personal instructional goals. I would tell the students what my goals were so they could hold me accountable. They could see what the goal setting process looks like. And times where, they might say, hey, Mr. Ehrman, like, you said this was one of your goals. You haven't done anything for it. Like, what's going on? Calling me out and then me
Yeah.
starting it again, or explaining, I decided to fade away from that. But just involving students in our processes, I think is so important, and trying to be as explicit as possible with them as to what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it, and what those different strategies look like. Like I've said this many times on the podcast, I would teach my students what wait time was. I would explain to them the term, why I use it, and what I'm giving them time to do. And I enhanced the wait time because they realized I was waiting until they all had an idea and they all raised their hand, and he was going to stand there as long as he wanted until everyone did their part and held themselves individually accountable. And I think sometimes we don't do that enough with our students, and being explicit in what we're trying to do, what our strategy is, how we're trying to do that, and just, kind of moving in that direction with them. I just think is so important.
It's so powerful. It's so important to give kids the permission to ask you, right? Or to call you out. Like I think my history teachers in school, great people, but I never felt like I had the ability to say, why are we learning this? And genuinely tell me why. Like I love the history class. I wasn't the student that was going to be the disciplinary case, but I did want to know why. And so I think the wait time is definitely something that has been a learned behavior for me, not something that comes natural. It takes work.
Yeah, it takes
But when it comes to giving students the permission to say, it's okay if you disagree with me. It's okay for you to say, I disagree, and modeling those pieces of civic discourse, right? Modeling those sentence starters, those stems. So they learn how to have discussions. I know I printed them out and I taped them on every single desk in my classroom. This is how we talk to one another. And then you've got to create the space and the time, like you were saying, Ken, to give students the ability to share.
Exactly. It's creating that space. It's so important. I can share a story as well. When I was traveling around with the 2022 Texas Teacher of the Year, I had to modify everything because, I tried to do a whole blended, some type of blended learning. And I thought it was working. I thought it was going great until I had a student come up to me somewhere in November and just told me, sir, no one wants to tell you this, but we're not learning. And we don't want to hurt your feelings. We don't want you to be upset with us, but it's not working. I said, no, I want to hear feedback. I want you to let me know. So what is it that I'm doing wrong? So I got the whole class involved after she told me, and I made the changes that I needed to make. And I was teaching an accountability subject, which was biology in Texas. And out of the 110 kids that I only had one kid who didn't pass, but it wasn't for her and creating that, or myself creating, or ourselves, the students and I creating that space that we had and the relationship that we had, I would have never would have changed what I was doing, and these kids, I would have failed these kids. So it is important to create those spaces and allowing them to have that voice that they need. And I love it. Thank you so much for
Right.
sharing.
Well, and Raymond, for you, like having that heart and having just the humility and letting go of your pride to accept it,
Hmm.
right? You could have very easily, they could have told you that, and you could have disregarded it completely.
Hmm.
And as teachers, we have to make sure that our ego's not getting in the way
Exactly.
of
Mhm.
what kids need.
Yep.
You have to take total ownership.
Yep.
Jocko Willett has a fantastic book called Total Ownership. I think it's Total Ownership, or maybe that's a phrase he uses. But he's got a leadership book, and it's just about, if anything goes wrong, you as the leader, you are accountable.
That's right.
You have to
Buck stops
reflect
here.
and say,
Harry Truman, right?
what could you have done differently to allow the people you're leading to make a better decision, or
Right.
to have not caused that. And, Raymond, I appreciate that story. And I think one of the things you can do as a teacher is, one, reflect on what type of relationships you're forming with your students. How authentic are you being? How real are you being? And you can also just say, if I do something that you feel is not working for you instructionally, I want you to tell me. And you remind them every couple of weeks, once a month, once a week, whatever that is, like, remind them. When I've facilitated graduate courses, I've told the teachers, if there's something I do that bothers you, please tell me, because I don't want to do it for the next 8 weeks and just have you annoyed with me. And I've said it to the same thing of the staff I'm leading right now. I've never been a principal before, so I'm going to try my best. And if there's something I'm doing that is clearly a bad decision, or I'm clearly not picking up these road signs that I should be looking at, I want you to say, hey, Ken, think about this. This doesn't seem to be working, or did you consider this, or all those different pieces. We just have to be, again, explicit and honest with the students that we're working with.
I think that's really important for us to do towards our students, for sure, like in any capacity that they're in. But the first day of Peace Corps, one of the trainers he paraphrased a quote from Lao Tzu, and talked about go where you're sent, do what you can with what you have, where you are, and at the end they will say, we've done this ourselves. And that to me is really my definition of leadership. But I think that's what creates teachers, by and large, and yes, this is a generalization, but I think teachers are humble people. I think they're humble people to a fault. And I think we work really, really hard at being so humble because we know we have to uplift students and to create that climate for them to be honest with us. But we are so humble that we don't advocate for ourselves loud enough. Right? The three of us have been in positions where our voices and our platforms have been elevated, and we've been put in positions where we have, oh yes, we can try to get things done, and we've been put in rooms where we can talk to movers and shakers. But the vast majority of teachers I know have things to say, and they either think they aren't going to be heard, or they think that what they have to say isn't good enough, and that's just not true. What they have to say is the exact same thing we're going to tell our students. Your voice has power. How do we get our colleagues? How do we create those spaces for our colleagues too? Because we are humble people, and that's an incredible strength. It's a wonderful virtue to have, but we need to stop being so humble in certain circles so that our country can hear our voices collectively.
Completely agree.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So I would love to continue this conversation, but for timing purposes, I want to jump into our exit ticket, which is the same 4 questions we ask every guest every week. Question number 1: what is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
Know their anchors. So the whole idea of the amygdala, calming it down so your prefrontal cortex can learn. Know what your students' anchors are. It changed my world. I give a weekly check-in on Wednesdays, and one of the rosebud and the thorn, we do a breathing exercise, but asking students anchors and specific students. So I have a spreadsheet now, and if I know they're going through something, I go out of my way to put something in my desk so I can be ready if they start to have a meltdown or if they're just having a bad day. I don't need to say any words, I just sit something on their desk, or I put a note on their desk to remind them of their anchor so that they can make, if it's a person, they can make that person proud.
Mm.
And man, those kids will run through walls for me now. And
Yep.
it has nothing to do with me, really. I'm not special in any way. I'm just reminding them where their why is, right? I'm just reminding them what brings them joy, what makes them feel loved, what makes them feel safe. And that to me is, I think, a necessity. I think every teacher should know their students' anchors. And I think every principal, every admin should know their teachers and their building's anchors.
Completely agree. So now on to the next question. What is the best advice you've ever received from a colleague, supervisor, or even a student?
Probably you are enough. I struggle with that idea of that I earn my title, right? That I deserve it. I don't. But I am enough. I think it goes along with that. But from the enough, I had a former colleague come to a speech I gave over the last year,
Mhm.
and she called me out pretty hard. She said, "You're talking about imposter syndrome and you're saying you don't deserve your title." She goes, "But you need to start practicing both and. Both and.
Yep.
That other people can both be deserving of this and be incredible educators, and you can be deserving of where you are." And that to me is not making ourselves small. That means that we are enough, because an unregulated teacher, an unhealthy teacher, cannot help regulate or make a healthy child.
Exactly.
So that's
I
the
love it.
most important thing. I mean, go way back to student teaching, and similar thing, my supervising teacher said, let the one positive get you through the 1,000 negative.
Mhm.
Oh, okay. I can focus on that one positive because I made a difference. And that idea of you are enough is always going to be one of those things that I share with student teachers that I have in my classroom now. You're not just a teacher. You're not just anything. You are enough because of who you are, and you're supposed to be where you are.
All right. So we know how the school year goes in waves, and there are those days or weeks that we struggle to survive. What is something that every educator needs to hear to power up in that moment of struggle?
To power up, I like it. I feel like I should be at track practice right now and be like, let's go, pump it up. But yeah, every educator it should know that they're not alone, right? I think we talk all the time about not creating silos. I need to be in other teachers' classrooms more, and they need to be in mine. I really, to be powered up, we have to know that education is not a solitary profession. We do things collectively, we do things collaboratively. And in order to do things really, really well, we need to work together in that. And I think sometimes myself, I'm definitely guilty of this, being overloaded over the last year, giving speeches and traveling the country.
Mhm.
I didn't go into the teacher's lounge and eat lunch. I turned my lights off in my classroom and I just survived. And that's okay too,
Yes.
as
Mhm.
long as you're communicating to people, hey, if you're struggling and you do that for a long time, ask for help. Like we just need each other. And I've tried so many times. The teachers in our building have tried so many times to be like, let's work together, let's get in each other's classrooms. And it's just hard. It's hard to get over the nervousness that comes with that, especially when you're a new teacher. But I think that goes with relationship building. And as educators, we're expert relationship builders. And we need to do that for each other too, not just for kids.
Mhm.
So I think it needs to be an open door policy. Come into my room. I will support you in whatever way. Find your teacher bestie, or find someone that can be your person, and make those connections, because you're not alone. And it can't just be admin all the time, right? Admin
Yeah.
has their own worries and their own frustrations and their own struggles. Those teacher leaders that maybe are gifted in seeing people need to use their abilities for good in the
I
building.
completely agree. One of my greatest joys
Definitely.
is passing by a colleague's classroom and the door's open, and just standing outside and watching them do what they do.
Yeah.
It brought a peace and joy to me. So
You guys have your teacher besties?
So
I
last
know,
question
Ken, you're
here.
in the in the admin position now.
there's still a couple of teacher besties that are still honest
Yeah.
and straightforward and sincere with me, and say, hey, you know what?
Good. We
I
need
know
those
you have a
people,
new role,
right?
but let me check you right here. So they'll let me know how it's going and what they feel. So I love that they're still comfortable enough to come to me.
Yep.
I
Gotta have
totally
your
agree.
people.
So it's easy, and you mentioned this a little bit when you were talking about rockstar teachers earlier. So it's easy to fall into facilitating a repetitive classroom. What separates the teachers who are the ones constantly seeking to change, innovate, and adopt new teaching strategies?
Ooh, my colleagues would tell me I don't need to change and adopt as many things as I do. But I mean, this is just, I think a lot of people would say this, but it's being okay with failure.
Yeah.
You learn just as much from failure as you do from anything else. So I think what sets apart rockstar teachers is the fact that they're okay screwing up. And I think students need to see that from us, right? I love to try new things because I want students to be people that try new things. And so I last week I failed miserably. The technology that I was using, I've used it for several years now, changed, doesn't work in the same way anymore. Tech guys couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure it out. Told the students, well, this is on me. I screwed it up. And then they need to see me adapt
Yeah.
and pivot, because that is a teachable and it's a work skill. They're going to have to do that as parents. They're going to have to do that as employees somewhere. They might have to do that as if they enlist in the military. They're certainly going to have to do that if they're athletes in snap moments. So how are we modeling that? How are we showing them that failure is okay as long as you
That
fail
is-
forward? That's the most important part.
Yeah, and being a high school teacher, right? Your first period is going to be completely different than your last period, and sometimes it's a completely different activity than what you started off during the day. Is about adapting and getting to know your students, getting to know yourself. And that's one of the things. One of the questions they asked me one time is, "What is it that sets you apart from everybody else?" I said, "I'm not afraid to fail. I'm not afraid to crash and burn." And all of us three right here, from this conversation today, we've all pushed the envelope somehow, some way. But the reason we push the envelope because we're not afraid to fail, because we always know that we're going to be okay.
Sure.
So to close it out here, so how can our audience connect with you in the future?
Oh, I love that question. I like to connect. I like to be available to people. I just said this to a bunch of finishing student teachers this afternoon, but I am kind of a social media junkie. I set some rules for myself because I think that's healthy. But social media wise, I am on, it's going to date me. I always say Twitter, X now, at T_Cocanower, Cocanower, but it's pronounced Cocanower. Like if you drink a Cocanower, you'd be very ill. And I am on Instagram at Coco the Explorer 23, TikTok Coco the Explorer 23, kind of like Dora the Explorer, because usually when my hair was shorter, my Halloween costume that was my go-to was Dora, because I'm an explorer and I love travel the world. But yeah, on social media platforms, even through bhmsd.org, as Teacher of the Year, they gave me a site to connect with people, or just out and about. Man, I like, if you see me in person, especially if you're in the state of Indiana, come up and say hi. I don't know a stranger, and I speak a couple languages, so I like to learn from people.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tara. This has really been a really enjoyable, insightful conversation. So we appreciate your time, and it's very clear why you were selected as a Teacher of the Year. It's very clear that your students are very fortunate to have
Raymond.
you on a
I
daily
appreciate
basis.
the platform. Thanks for getting teacher voices out there. It could not be more important in the time that we're living in. So
exactly,
I appreciate that very much. So thank you again for this conversation. Your social media link will be linked in our show notes, which can be found wherever you're watching or listening. If this is the first time you're listening to our podcast, please consider subscribing so you can hear from many other educators.
Please do subscribe.
Just like you heard from Tara in this episode. And Raymond, why don't you close us on out of here?
All right. As we power down this episode, Tara, you have left us feeling powered up. Thank you for this time, and we look forward for another great conversation coming up soon, hopefully next week, and we'll talk to you then.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to or watching us on YouTube. Each week we get to talk to amazing educators who are making a positive impact on the lives of students, their colleagues, administrators, and education as a whole. It's been such a privilege every week to be able to talk to these incredible individuals, learn from them, grow with them, and better myself and all of education through these conversations. If you haven't already, please consider sharing this with a colleague, someone who can benefit and be powered up from the experience of listening to these incredible conversations. Because of Powered Up, we are powering education by empowering you.